In considering what has occurred in the opening chapters of Genesis, we have briefly talked about some of those things. Some things I assume that you already know in good detail. The first thing we have in Genesis 1 is what?
Creation.
Creation. We want to work creation. Genesis 2, what happens in Genesis 2? Anybody know? No. Genesis 2 is specifically how God created man and woman. And don't be fooled by those who don't seem to understand the difference. I'm amazed sometimes at the people that say, well, obviously Genesis 2 is a contradiction of Genesis 1 because it's a whole different creation story. You know, are you idiots? And the answer to that is apparently yes. Because any normal reading would indicate to you that Genesis 2 is simply going back and going into more detail about what happened on the sixth day when God created man and woman. So I'm just surprised that some people that should know better than say things like that. All right, then what happens in Genesis 3? Then we have the fall. What's the fall mean? Is that like what happens before winter? What do you mean by the fall? What's the fall?
The first sin.
Right, by Adam and Eve. All right, so we have the fall of man in Genesis 3. Genesis 4, we have the first murder.
Cain killed Abel.
Who?
Cain killed Abel.
Cain killed Abel. And so that's an indication of the effects of sin that were brought about by the fall. And then in the other chapters have some other things in there. But I want to get to chapter 6. You were to have read today Genesis 6, 1 through 7. Yeah, it's on the board. So let's look at that. You have your Bibles with you. Let's open to that. Something that you have already read. It's interesting, in years past, how many students have never even heard of what transpires here. How many of you did read it? Okay, so quite a few of you did. How many of you who read it had never read this before? Okay, all of you have. Okay, interesting. All right, the controversy is over who are these sons of God. So you can see in verse 1, man was multiplying on the face of the land. Daughters were born to them. And then in verse 2, we find that the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. And that happens quite often. Men find women attractive, right? And that's what makes the population grow. All right. So the sons of God saw the daughters of men. They took them as their wives. Any they chose. All right, keep that in mind. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Now some think that means that's how the age limit for each person, but I don't think that's what he's saying. And God's saying, I'm so upset with what's going on. I'm 120 years that I'm bringing the hammer down. We've got 120 years left before I bring judgment. Then we're told that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And then we see in verse 5, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things, and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. It's a good thing. Noah found favor. All right, now, so the question is, who are these sons of God that had sexual relations with the women and caused all this problem? So what have you heard about this?
I was going to ask you a question.
Oh.
How many people were on the earth when the flood happened?
It's difficult to know for sure. Some estimate billions. If you look at the number of years between creation and the flood, it could have been
Now, it may not have been what normally would have been produced by men and women because they lived so long. I think that their age was somewhat prorated. How else to say it? But in other words, some of the biblical accounts indicate that some people didn't have children until like they're 100 years old. Well, I wonder if maybe they aged more slowly so that 100 would have been like a teenager. That's just kind of speculation. That's hard to know for sure. And we don't find, one of the questions people have is, well, we find fossils of all these animals and stuff buried all over the earth. Why don't we find humans? Well, there are some, but humans were able to figure out how to stay afloat longer, which means they weren't under that initial burying that took place with along with other animals. Good question. Yeah.
I don't know how to ask this, but so God doesn't make mistakes. Also, like with the flood, did He consider humans as a mistake, or was it sinning because He? And I don't know how to ask it.
I think when we see things like that He regretted or He was sorry that He made them, it wasn't anything that took Him by surprise. Those are just words that are used to communicate to us in a human way as close as possible to what God's emotions were. All right, when we say we're sorry we did something, we generally mean if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't do it. But God had this planned out from before He ever created the world. And so we know that He's not looking back and saying, I wish I hadn't done that. But He is feeling the emotion of having created people who were to be His, be people with whom He'd have a relationship and have them all turn against Him. So that's the best I can do with that. Okay, now let's see. Oh, who are the sons of God? Have any of you heard anything about who the sons of God? Anybody heard anybody teach on this? No? Okay. The number one response to the question is who are the sons of God is, drum roll, fallen angels. The reasons for believing that these are fallen angels that are having sexual relations with human women are the following. First of all, the Hebrew word sons of God, which is B'nai Elohim, maybe you've heard the name Ben as part of meaning son of. B'nai Elohim is used other places in the Old Testament to refer to angels. And so people look at that and say, well, it must mean angels here too. These must be angels. But what's the problem with seeing them as angels coming down and having sexual relations with human women? That's not exactly angelic activity, is it? And so, well, it has to be fallen angels then. These are angels, they're called sons of God, but they're fallen angels. And they're having sexual relations with women. And then the next thing, people believe then that as a result of these sexual relations, that the Nephilim were those that were born to these women, and they were like monsters, giants. Because later on we find the word used for giants. All right, now that's the reason behind seeing them as fallen angels. Can you think of any problems with that? Any problems with fallen angels coming and mating with human women? Anybody see a problem? You're perfectly fine with that. What kind of a being is an angel? A spirit being, which means they have no soul. Wouldn't say soul, because soul is used in different ways, but usually indicates a living being. So let's not say they don't have a soul, but they don't have, if they're a spirit being, get the contrast here. If they're a spirit being, they do not have a physical body, right? They're not physical beings. So what about in the Old Testament when an angel appears to somebody?
It's in a dream.
What?
It's in a dream.
Sometimes it's a dream, but sometimes it's real. So how can they see them if they're a spirit? Because a lot of times they appear as men. They take on the form of a man. They're able to put on a form that makes them look like a man, but they're not really. In fact, one of the tests as to whether it's an angel or a spirit or not is, in the Old Testament, you'll see times when they're offered food and they refuse it. Why? You know, if I eat something, it just goes right through me. Yeah. They don't have any intestines. They don't have any real physicality. It's just a form. They just look like a man. And in fact, remember when Jesus appeared to the disciples in the upper room, when he walked through the door and appeared there, they thought he was a spirit. And what did he do to prove that he wasn't a spirit being, that he really had a physical body?
Showed them the scars.
He did that. Showed him physically that he had the scars. What else did he do?
Did he eat fish?
He ate. Yeah, he ate fish. He says, a spirit doesn't eat. Can't eat. All right? So, the problem with this sons of God being fallen angels is they're spirit beings. Now, why is that a problem? Why is it a problem that they are spirit beings? If they're spirit beings and can only put on the form of a human without it really being a human body, can they have sexual relations? No. They would have to be able to create a real human body that's fully functional. And angels can't create. So, for me, that's a major problem for this view. If they're spirit beings, they can't have sexual relations with a human because they're not a real physical body. They don't have a real physical body. Does that make sense? There's another problem with the issue, with this perspective, I think, and that is what happens as a result of what we're given here in these first few verses of chapter 6. Does God have a response to what happens here? What is it? What response does he have?
He's going to destroy the earth.
He's going to destroy the earth. Wipe out all of mankind. Right? How does that affect angels? You nasty angels, you did something wrong. Now I'm going to destroy all people. What about the angels? Doesn't affect them at all. Right? So the punishment doesn't fit the crime. It's punishing people that didn't have anything to do with it. If these are angels. You follow? So I even though probably 90% of Bible scholars and so on probably would go along with this, I haven't taken a poll, but it seems like a lot of commentaries, a lot of people agree with this. I think it has a lot of problems. And because of those problems, some people long ago came up with another solution. And they said that the sons of God refers to a spiritual heritage. That these are descendants, the sons of God show a non-spiritual heritage. These are descendants of Cain. Cain killed his brother, and after that, all his descendants were evil and bad and all that. And so they intermarried with the descendants of Seth, who are called the daughters of Ben, and they were the godly line. All right. They understood that angels can't have sexual relations, so they came to this position, but I think there's problems here too. Anybody notice a problem with this idea that the sons of God are descendants of Cain and the daughters of men are descendants of Seth?
They're the same thing. So it's like not going to make a difference.
What do you mean they're the same thing?
Because they come from different people. To me, like they're not people.
Yeah, what they would say is that these are spiritual people, the women, intermarrying with non-spiritual people, ungodly people, the sons of God. So yeah, they're all people, but it's a spiritual thing, they would say. All right, yeah.
Why would they be called sons of God if they're not spiritual?
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
a child
Wait a minute.
of God.
These are the ungodly people, and you're calling them sons of God. That in itself would be kind of a problem. In addition, did God ever say, make sure you descendants of Seth don't ever marry anybody from the descendant? No. I mean, there's a whole bunch of brothers and sisters from Adam and Eve. We're not told all their names. They multiplied. There's a lot of brothers and sisters. So you can't keep them really straight, keep them apart. The other thing is, I had something in my mind. Where'd it go? Okay. Oh, wouldn't you think that if this is a matter of being unequally yoked with an unbeliever kind of thing, and it was descendants of Cain, descendants of Seth, that somewhere in the context there would be something about the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth. But there's not. There's nothing there that indicates this. All right, so there are two different solutions to the question as to who are the sons of God. One is that they're spirit beings, and that doesn't seem to match. One is that they're physical beings, they're just not very spiritual. No pun intended. And that doesn't seem to match either, because the other thing is that if there are all these descendants of Seth that are supposedly godly and intermarrying with the ungodly, and God says that all of mankind is evil, so where are the descendants of Seth there? It doesn't seem to fit that either. So, what's the solution? Does Mr. Henry have a third option? Do you hope I do? Yes, there's a third option. And that is to see the sons of God as what we call despotic rulers. Are you familiar with the word despot? It means dictator. So these are dictating rulers that are dictators. They're kings that rule with an iron hand. They total control. All right. Now, where do we get this idea? Well, the problem is that we don't have the word sons of God used in the Old Testament to refer to these kind of men. But in the cultures all around Israel, all the different cultures, the term sons of God is used for rulers. So I would contend that since Moses is writing this in the context of the children of Israel coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, that he might have used a term that was known throughout the ancient world as a term meaning rulers who are in total control. Does that make sense? So this is a time where culture outside the Bible helps to inform as to what something means that's in the Bible. So what does it mean here then? Let's look back at the text. So the sons of God, these men who took control, these rulers, saw the daughters of men were attractive, and they took them as their wives, any they chose. What's the problem here? The problem is that they were using their position of authority to gather whatever women they wanted, regardless of whether they were married or not. We're going to find out later when we look at what happens in Egypt, when Abraham goes down to Egypt. The Pharaoh had the total control so he could take whatever women he wanted. And that's what Abraham was afraid of, we'll see. So that's what's wrong here, is that men became so evil and self-centered and became powerful, so they took whatever women they wanted. Because they were attractive. They were looking on the outside, their beauty. All right, so then we have what God says about his spirit not abiding in man. Then verse 4, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Now, a lot of people think the Nephilim were the products of the sons of God and the daughters of men. I think that the Nephilim is a word describing the sons of God. In other words, he's saying these sons of God were big men. They were giants. Because the word Nephilim occurs later when they're entering the land of Canaan. It said there's Nephilim in the land. And they weren't the products of some kind of demonic birth. They were simply giants. And I think what Moses is pointing out here is that these sons of God were giants. That's how they became so powerful. They were big men. And you know that that would be the case. You know, if you're living in some village somewhere, who's going to be your leader? It's going to be the big guy who can lead you in battle, right? And then if he's big and nobody can beat him, he's going to take over. I mean, you can see that happening, right? That could have happened very easily. And it talks about then when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. These are famous men that we heard stories even after the flood about these men who were big and mighty and strong, and they took over. And then we see the response of God is that he saw the wickedness of man was great, and every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So this is simply an example of how the hearts of all men were. The fact that these men could take over like that. And so I think that is the explanation that fits the best. It is definitely a minority view. You'd be hard-pressed to find even a lot of commentaries that even have this view in them. Or a lot of pastors probably may not even know about this view. But I think it's the one that fits the context and the history the best. Do you see any problems or have any questions about any of these? All right, let's go to what happens next then. Following this episode, when God destroys the earth except for Noah and his family in the worldwide flood. Now, anytime you think about the flood, you think about maybe those storybooks you read when you were little with a nice picture on it of the ark, or maybe a nursery school or preschool that you went to, maybe had an ark painted on the wall, or maybe even your own bedroom. Did anybody have an ark painted on the wall of your bedroom, or a picture of the ark hung up there? None of you did? Do you ever remember seeing that in a preschool or school somewhere? Okay. And usually, if you saw a picture like that, it would look something like this, right? All right. What's wrong with this picture? Anything wrong with this picture? Right?
Well, a couple of things, but one of them being that the ark is way too small.
It's way too small for all the animals that had to be on it, right? Okay. What else? Bill?
The animals are too big.
Animals are too. What do you mean they're too big?
I heard that most likely Noah would have brought babies.
Oh, okay. So these are fully grown adults,
Yeah.
Robbie?
They wouldn't stick their heads out of the boat.
Yeah. Don't you always see giraffes sticking their heads out? Isn't that always in the picture of the ark? Yeah. You got these other animals too. Birds are sitting outside enjoying the sunshine, right? Brennan?
The ocean looks calm.
Looks pretty calm. Yeah. And what else is missing? Where are all the drowning people? Next time you see an ark like this painted on the wall of somebody's bedroom or preschool, ask them, where are all the drowning people? See what kind of reaction you get. What?
Children might be scared.
Yeah, so we're putting, this comes associated with children. We put this on walls for children. And this represents when God killed everybody in the world. There's a nice thought for children to have before they go to sleep at night, right? That's why you have to put it in an unrealistic way, I suppose. Brenna?
Well, I would think they would do that because of God's promise after the flood.
Yeah, because there's usually a rainbow there too, right? Yeah, God won't flood you while you're sleeping. Yes. Go on.
So it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Did it stop? When it stopped raining, how long was there still water?
I'd have to look. I think it was another 120 days, something like that. If you look in chapter 7, let's see, the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days after it stopped, and then slowly receded. All right, so this is not realistic, right? You have another question?
Yeah, I was going to ask what your take on Kenji with this.
I think we'll probably maybe talk about that later, so save it. If I don't address it, bring it up again. All right, what's the problem with having pictures like this? It's just fun, right?
It's a pleasure cruise.
It's a pleasure cruise. So what's wrong? Anything wrong with that? Anything wrong with having telling children having this picture in their storybooks and things like that? Can that lead to anything that might not be good?
Yeah.
What?
They'd see a bunch of problems and then they will say, well, the Bible's not true.
Exactly. Say, well, this obviously can't be true, the way it's pictured. And so then they assume that the Bible's not true. Not that the art isn't true, but the Bible's not true. In addition to that, we tell children, or we're going to tell them a story about Noah and the ark. Well, most of the time in school, if you're hearing a story, what are you hearing?
Fiction.
You're hearing fiction, right? You're hearing stuff that was made up by somebody. And so we do that over and over again to children throughout their Sunday school years or in Christian school. We're going to tell a story. We're going to hear another story, and pretty soon we have ingrained in people's minds that that's not really true. And then pictures like this seem to also say the same thing. All right, so what did the ark really look like? You've probably seen pictures. Here's a drawing that one person did of the ark, a little more realistic. We don't know exactly, but we know the dimensions, and it was looked more like this. Now, one of the things, there are a number of evidences we can look at to show that the worldwide flood really did happen. All right, we can look at geology, we can look at the fossil record, a lot of different things. But one of the things that I think is pretty convincing is the abundance of flood stories, flood narratives that we find throughout the world. As it says here, almost every culture, and that's in history, has a worldwide flood legend. How could that be if the people who wrote the Bible just made it up? And here's some examples you can see around here. We're going to look at some specifics. For example, in Hawaii, it says this, and you're going to notice some similarities and a few differences. After the death of Kinuahona, the first man, the world became a wicked, terrible place to live. There was one good man left. His name was Nuhu. Is that pretty close to Noah? Yeah. Is the situation accurate that's described? Yeah. He made a great canoe with a house on it. Now, if you're in Hawaii, that's probably as close as you're going to get to describing an ark. Filled it with animals. Waters came up over all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nuhu and his family were saved. So is that essentially accurate? A few facts that are a little off, but for the most part, it's true. This is in Asia. I can't remember where exactly. Fu'u, his wife, 3 sons, and 3 daughters escaped a great flood. He and his family were the only people alive on earth. After the great flood, they repopulated the world. All right, you've got 3 daughters instead of 3 wives of his sons, but that could be a translation problem too. But is that essentially accurate? I mean, that pretty much tells what happened. The name's different, but it's a different language. There are more than 270 flood legends in the world. Here's some examples. This is what I think is really interesting. If you look at the Chinese language, Chinese does not have letters like we have ABC. They have symbols, which means if you're learning to read Chinese, you can't just learn 26 letters and how they're put together. You've got to learn thousands of word symbols. And sometimes, in order to make another word, they put several symbols together. This is interesting. And there are a lot of symbols like this in Chinese, by the way. A lot of words. The word for boat in Chinese is made up of 3 symbols. The word for vessel, the word for 8, and the word mouth, or people. So the word for boat in Chinese is 8 people on a vessel. Now, where would that come from? They don't know. But it seems kind of obvious that it came from the boat that Noah was on. That came to be their word for boat. If you look at the word for man, there's a lot of different words in Chinese. I have a book back here if you're interested about different words in the Chinese language and how they show a tradition of what's in the Bible. Okay, let's look at another one here. The Toltec people in ancient Mexico, their story says the First World lasted 1,716 years. That's pretty close. Destroyed by a great flood, covered even the highest mountains. There's a few men who escaped the destruction in a closed chest. That's actually probably more accurate than the little boats we see in our storybooks, right? Following the Great Flood, they began to multiply, built a very high tower. Is that accurate? Yeah. For a safe place if the world were destroyed again. However, the languages became confused. Is that right? Different language groups wandered to other parts of the world. The Toltecs claim they started as a family of 7 friends and their wives who spoke the same language. They crossed great waters, lived in caves, wandered 104 years until they came to southern Mexico. And that was 520 years after the Great Flood. Does that sound like that could be true? Yeah. Babylonia. Talks about the Great Flood and the deluge and the tablets that have been discovered there. Let's skip down through. It says here that the account of the flood could have been reported by someone like King Amraphel, who is mentioned in Genesis 14:1, who was one of the early kings of Babylonia after the flood. Another flood account was prevalent during the time of Alexander the Great, probably recorded by a Babylonian historian. He wrote of the antediluvian, that is pre-flood rulers, and of the great deluge that covered the earth. This is a tablet that has a list of Sumerian kings. The Sumer is going to be the first civilization we'll study that occurs after the flood. And there's a list of kings. Here's the writing as it appears on here, which you can't read. This is what it says. The flood swept over the land. After the flood had swept over the land, and kingship had descended from heaven, Kish, or Cush, became the seat of kingship. Notice, the flood swept over the land. And so in this listing of kings, it lists the kings before the flood and the kings after the flood. This is a chart showing the flood traditions throughout the world. And you can see the ones that have a full representation of the biblical idea and some that have the partial. So if you look down through here, we've got Assyria, Persia, Syria, Egypt, Greece, Aztec, Peru, I mean all these different ones. And you can see that each one, like these all have a full representation of man and transgression. These all have divine destruction. These have a favored family. An ark provided. Look at it, almost all of them have destruction by water. Humans saved. All these different things that are consistent throughout all these different traditions. And it looks like the Assyrian Babylonian is the one that's the most complete, and interestingly enough, that's pretty close to the area where people scattered after the flood. How could that just happen? How could all these different cultures come up with all of this separately if it wasn't really true? I don't think they could have. So I think that's a really good evidence for the fact that the worldwide flood described in Genesis really did happen. Now, considering what the ark looked like, this is a drawing done by an artist after talking to an older man, I think he was in his 70s at the time, who reported that he had been a child with his father on an expedition to Mount Ararat sent by the Russian government during World War I. So it'd be in the that'd be the 19 teens. I don't remember the exact date. 1915, 16, somewhere in there. And he said, and he described what he saw to this artist. And this artist drew according to what he described. And when this man saw this image, he said, that's exactly what I saw back in 1910. Now, he was part of an expedition, his father was, sent there from the Russian government, because the Russian government was a Christian government, even though the Tsar of Russia made a lot of mistakes, and some claim he was an evil man, but they did believe in Christ. And so they sent this expedition down to look for Noah's Ark. The weather was better than usual, and so apparently they found this. This man said he remembers as a boy even running on top of it. They took pictures of it. But back then, you ever seen cameras used back in early 20th century? You know, those big things, and you don't have film. You got to slide these kind of tray-like things in, take a picture, you slide it back out, and that's your negative, and you got to go take it somewhere and develop it. Well, that's what they did, and they sent these pictures back to Moscow ahead of them. So what happened to the pictures? What these guys didn't know is while they were gone, a revolution took place in Russia during World War I. There were a number of groups that overthrew the government of the Tsar. And one of those groups, then after they got control, drove out all the others, killed the people in the others. That group was called the Bolsheviks. They established in Russia a communist government. And what do communists think about God? And somebody in the other class said, "Niet, there's no God." So what happened when these plates arrived of all these pictures of the ark? They looked at them and they said, "There is a God after all. I changed my mind." Haley, you look like you don't believe that. No, that didn't happen. They destroyed them. So the only pictures that have ever been taken of the ark were destroyed by these atheistic communists in Russia. And this man who described this, remembered what had happened. Apparently he didn't tell too many people about it, but somebody finally got word and sent a reporter and asked him. Tomorrow we'll talk more about the ark, about the flood, and some other things. Make sure you bring your Bible and your textbook.